So the last few talks I've been talking about this idea of the role of thoughts and beliefs and views and what an impact they have in our practice, and how the Buddha really emphasized direct experience rather than views. But of course we also have right view as the right wise view. I'll talk a little bit about that as the first step in the Noble Eightfold Path. But today I want to talk a little bit different idea about views, in that sometimes we use spiritual, I'll just use that generic word, kind of spiritual views or ideas or beliefs as a way to sidestep or avoid what's going on in our lives. Sometimes we're maybe holding on to views as a way to not be with what our experience is and help us so that we don't have to face some uncomfortable things, whether it's emotional issues or things that are inside us that we maybe not even clear what it is. We just have this feeling like we don't want to look at it, whatever it is. So maybe I'd say that the key words here are like sidestep and avoid. So of course, like views, of course we need to have them. They are an integral part of what it means to be human. It's an integral part of our practice, or even if you don't have a practice. But it's when we use them as a way to not look at things that may be helpful. And not only that, we use the views to kind of legitimize our avoidance. Somehow we're using them as a way to like, oh yeah, I don't need to look at that because of X, Y, or Z. And I'll explore that a little bit tonight. So we might say that this is a process in which we are using the practice that is supposed to help us work with a problem as a way to avoid a problem. So we started thinking it's going to help us. You know what I'm going to... Sorry about that. So it's when we have this practice that we initiated to help us work or find some ease with a problem, but the way that we unknowingly kind of are using it is to just help us avoid it, or not look at it, or sidestep it in some kind of way, or whitewash it, or this thing that we want to try to find a better relationship with or have more ease with. Instead, we end up kind of avoiding. So for example, we might have this Buddhist teaching on equanimity. It's really held, really high esteem in Buddhist practice. It's being able to have this sense of balance and evenness with whatever is arising. But we might hear this. In fact, I think it's probably all of us do this or have done it. This teaching about equanimity, this evenness and balance. And we might kind of like slide into indifference. And we're calling it equanimity. Oh, this is a wise, mature way to be with it. But in fact, what has happened is we've actually disconnected from our experience. Disconnected from what we're feeling, or we're disconnected to what's happening in our environment. And that's why we're able to have some balance and evenness, is because we're not engaged with what's happening. Instead, we have this aloofness, maybe even some coldness. And we're thinking like, oh, this is equanimity. But in fact, equanimity has a quality of warmth and connection and openness and spaciousness. And that's what gives the room for the balance and evenness, is because there's this big space in which we're allowing things to be whatever they are, but we're still connected with what's happening. So that's maybe one way. Maybe another way is if we might have this thought in our mind, or we might actually hear ourselves saying something like, well, if that makes you uncomfortable, well, that's just part of your practice. Kind of like saying, well, it's your problem if what I said makes you feel uncomfortable, or it's your problem. You just have to work with it. If somehow what's happening here in the community, in the group, or something like this isn't your preference. And to be sure, sometimes that is an appropriate response, but if we always find ourselves kind of thinking that people are getting annoyed with us or irritated with us, and we're thinking, well, you just need to practice with that. Clearly you're not as awakened as I am, and you have preferences, or something like this. Maybe I'm exaggerating this to make a point, but there's a way in which we might think that, well, you just practice. Everybody just has to practice with whatever arises in their mind, and we don't somehow have to take responsibility for how we're affecting others. Maybe to some of the insensitivities we have, or some ignorance we have, and biases we have that come out in our language or our behavior, and that we might not intend to, but it might be hurtful to others. So instead of saying, oh, that's just your practice, can we recognize, oh, I harmed somebody with my words or my actions, even though we didn't mean to, instead of kind of trying to whitewash it away. So there's an expression that was coined by John Wellwood, a Buddhist practitioner. I think it was in the 90s. I think it was. He was a psychologist and a Buddhist practitioner. He has a few books that right now, the titles escape my mind. But I think he coined this expression, and it's called spiritual bypassing. Maybe you've heard of this. And I would say it's probably everybody does this. Of course we do. Because this is part of how we find our way with practice, or new ideas, or new ways of showing up, new ways maybe of speaking, interacting with others, is sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. Of course it does. It's not like we're going to hear something and then just do it perfectly every time. And sometimes we're not we don't feel well. Either we have some emotional turmoil, or we're not sleeping, or whatever it might be, physical pain. And so maybe we don't have access to our greatest wisdom, and instead we're slipping into something that we just feel like, okay, I need to avoid or bypass because I don't really have the capacity right now. Or maybe it's not a conscious thought, it just happens. It can be helpful to recognize, though, that this is something that's not uncommon. Psychologists, they like to look at this and they say, well, yeah, some people become really spiritual and do this spiritual bypass, and they'll use the language kind of like as a defense mechanism, as a way to disconnect us from our feelings, as a way to disengage with what's happening, or to shield us from something that's uncomfortable. Maybe it's some truth that we've seen about ourselves, or some truth that we've seen about our life that's not unfolding the way we expected, and rather than kind of acknowledging that, then maybe we're doing this spiritual bypassing. And so spiritual bypassing, is this related to our relationship to the practice, or how we're like holding on to it or interpreting it? So it's not so much our practice itself, I would say. I guess maybe one could argue that, okay, it is the practice, but it's like the manner in which we practice. But I don't want it to sound like, okay, well, you shouldn't do any spiritual things, Buddhist things, any spiritual tradition, because you're just using it to avoid the difficulties. I don't want to say that. I just want to highlight that this is a natural part of what happens, is that sometimes we use it as a way to just make ourselves feel better without actually using practices in a way to help us find more freedom. Sometimes we might think that just avoiding everything that's unpleasant is freedom, but there's a sense of freedom has a sense of possibility, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's not what we want, even though it's maybe even exactly what we don't want. But this sense of oh yeah, this has potential here. I can feel that this is the way forward. And often it is kind of like a feeling, like our intuition kind of acknowledges, okay, yeah, this is the way forward. So I'll say that for me, I would unknowingly would do a certain amount of this what we might call spiritual bypassing, is just because this mind, for whatever reason, can get settled. I have stories about why that is. Maybe I'll just say just my professional training and stuff was just a lot of having to focus, just years and years and years of having to focus, and just kind of bled into my meditation practice. So I would kind of use concentration as a way to kind of numb myself from, difficulties, some of the emotional turmoil or confusion, especially in my early retreat practice. I would go on all these retreats and get concentrated. And there was some relief there, and it wasn't all bad. Of course, there were some useful things too, but I didn't notice how I was often not being mindful, but just being concentrated, getting concentrated instead. So kind of maybe not as sensitive to what else was happening, like my environment or my inner life, but instead I was kind of concentrated. I found my way through that, but it took me some time because just to recognize, oh yeah, this was a habit that I'd fallen into that maybe it wasn't. There could have been worse habits, of course, right? But this idea, I thought I was being mindful and I thought I was following the instructions, and turns out I wasn't in the way that maybe would have been more helpful. I also know somebody was reporting to me that they were describing their practice, and we were talking about loving kindness practice. And this individual was saying, yeah, I'd love to do loving kindness. I do it all the time. And I thought, oh, that's fantastic. That's great. And we were talking about it a little bit more. And I said, well, maybe you could describe to me, what your loving kindness practice is. And essentially, it boiled down to whenever she was angry or annoyed with somebody, she would just, I said the gender, I meant not to, but this person would say, may you be happy. May you be healthy. But, it was kind of this contrived thing just to help her not feel the annoyance and frustration and anger. And she was doing it a lot all day long. So she was feeling like, oh yeah, I'm really spiritual and doing loving kindness practice. I don't blame her, of course. Because loving kindness sometimes does open our heart and make us feel this connection and warmth towards people. And we practice it with difficult people, so of course it makes sense to be doing it in this setting. But in this way, it was kind of like a sledgehammer or something, right, to maybe just make the situation go away, or make what she was feeling trying to go away. So spiritual bypassing also can be related to attachment to views. This holding on to views, beliefs, practices, thoughts. We might think that these are like spiritual thoughts or spiritual views or spiritual ideas, and therefore we should hold on to them. But there's a way in which, maybe I'll say this, that integral to Buddhist practice is even the idea that you practice. With meditation practice, with speech, with livelihood, with our actions, following the precepts, ethical behavior, right? There's all these things that we do, as opposed to just have beliefs or thoughts that we're just holding on to. And 7 factors of awakening, one of the key elements here is investigation, to be engaged with what's happening and to be open to learning about it, being open to learning something new. So it's really integral to practice these ideas of investigation and practicing. But there can be some way of doing spiritual practice in which kind of the investigation and the practice is kind of gone to the side. And instead we have these, dogmatism or fundamentalism or no, it's this way. And somehow there can be this feeling maybe it's comforting to okay, I know the truth. And I'm right and everybody else is wrong and I don't have to bother with all that pesky meditation practice. It's hard, I don't like it. I get to feel like I'm the right and everybody else is wrong. But of course, that kind of I want to say, of course we do this to different extremes about different ideas. A friend of mine was telling me about a small little sutta study group that got created, and people who were really dedicated to practice loved studying the suttas. And they would get together and read them and talk about them and some of them, one person read Pali, so could look at the language and talk about it and talk about how meaningful and fun and to be with like-minded people and to engage with them. Until they came to a particular sutta that really emphasized this one particular teaching. And one person said, I don't know, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not really going to emphasize that. And one other person said, no, you have to. How can you be a Buddhist practitioner? You have to believe all of this. And you're not a real Buddhist practitioner. This person happened to be the person who said, this isn't important for me right now, was a teacher, right, who had dedicated their life to being to the Dharma. But you could see where, this one individual had this one idea, and then that group kind of ended up falling apart. And there was a lot of kind of lament, it was so rich and fun and engaging and kind of opening up some new ideas. But because one person had this idea, these are these particular things that are in the suttas, and you absolutely have to believe them and orient your life around them. And if you don't, well, I can't practice with you, or something like this. So instead of this kind of engaging with or investigating, kind of sliding into some fundamentalism. And I know Gil and I, in our Majjhima class that we teach, the Sutta study class that we teach, we talk about this a lot, how the last thing we want is for some fundamentalism or dogmatism. So we often are looking at, okay, what are the Pali words here? And they can be understood this way, and they can be understood this other way. It's kind of translator's choice of how they interpret this or emphasize it, and really want to recognize that there's some ambiguity there. Last thing we want is to just cling and say, this is the absolute truth. That's not freedom. That's not freedom. If you feel like you have it and nobody else does, then you have to prop it up. No, that's true because X, Y, Z. And then you have to not be as open to other people. So there's this way in which holding on to views is a way of maybe spiritual bypassing, and views, maybe I'll say there are underlying beliefs or concepts or thoughts, notions that we have. And often they're hidden. We don't even really know that we have these views until we bump up against something that's really against our views or makes us feel uncomfortable. And then it's becomes highlighted. Oh yeah. So we may not become clear about our views until they are threatened, maybe, by a crisis. We may think that we understand impermanence until a loved one gets a terrible diagnosis. And then we realize, oh yeah, I did kind of have this hidden view that lots of things are impermanent, but somehow there's this way that we kind of thought there were some exceptions. And when we say it out loud, it doesn't make any sense, but we didn't realize how we kind of thought maybe relationships go sour. We kind of thought, oh no, I thought that this was something that was stable and was going to be a lasting source of happiness. Or maybe we may not even know about some of these deeper views that we have until they're reflected back to us by teachers or friends, or maybe even sometimes the most difficult people in our life. They're difficult because they're highlighting for us something that we don't like about ourselves, some idea that maybe we have this view that we must be productive. Like, that's what it means to be a good, quote unquote, person, is to be productive. And then we spend all of our time, trying to just do things. And then maybe something happens, we're not able to be productive. We get sick. Or maybe we lose our employment. Or maybe we have to stop doing what we usually do to take care of somebody. Or maybe we retire. And then we start to realize, oh, wow, now that I'm not productive in the way that I was, I didn't realize how I had this view that my value somehow was associated with this. And not recognizing that we have value. Of course we do. It's not dependent on how much we're doing. I know this is a little bit of heresy, especially here, kind of like in Silicon Valley, where we really pride ourselves in working. And I certainly went through phases in my life. I did that too. And, I still have some vestiges of that now. But what are some of these underlying views that we have? Maybe I'll also say that something about views is that they're resistant to change. Often, even if we have some information that says that maybe this doesn't make sense, they often have this kind of embeddedness or this inertia to them so that we can't just change them. And of course we know this, right, in the past couple of years, this has really been highlighted, that there might be this persistence of a view or a belief because we're getting all our information from just a very highly select sources that just can reaffirm our views. We're not exposed to any alternative ideas, or even this idea of confirmation bias, right? Where we might see some clear information that is not the same as our views. We might have maybe this underlying view that the world is not safe. And then we have to feel like we're always being vigilant. Might be a perfectly legitimate reason why a person doesn't think that the world is safe. I don't want to diminish that, but sometimes they are overlooking the times when they are feeling safe. When they're maybe at home with their loved ones under a blanket watching TV. Or when they're petting their dog, or something like this. So even though there might be some data that's coming in that there is times that we're safe, I don't want to diminish that we have these views. It's just human nature that we hold on to them and that we're impacted by earlier experiences in our life. So we don't want to have this idea of like, oh, I shouldn't hold on to views. Okay, now that I know that, I'm going to just drop all of them. I have to honor and respect our experience and just to recognize, oh, okay, this is a view I have. It feels integral to how I navigate the world. It feels integral to how I conceive of myself. And it makes sense right now. It's how I navigate right now. It's how I'm making sense of what it means to be the person that I experience myself to be right now. And have this little openness to that instead of this feeling like, nope, this is how it is. But there's also a way in which sometimes we might be holding on to views just because we don't like the ambiguity. We feel a little bit uncomfortable. There is something reassuring just about finding something to land on and stand on, like, nope, this is it. Trying to think of like one that I wanted to say the earth is flat. And certainly, right, there was a long time when people still believed that, even though, all the scientists and I guess the people going on the ships were coming back around, years later saying, actually, it's not flat. But there's a way in which we just want to have something decided. So we might hold on to it, and we don't want to address it again, like, nope, I just decided this once, and I'm not going to come back around. Or maybe there's just this idea of stubbornness, too. Don't want to change views because they don't want to acknowledge that maybe they're influenced by others, or maybe that somebody else had a better idea. Or that maybe it's what implies that maybe their idea wasn't the best idea. Something like this. So, clinging to views is a part of, I'll say maybe a part of spiritual bypassing. But I would say, so it's not like we have to abandon all our views. We don't go to the opposite extreme. We might think of views and our relationship to them happening along a spectrum. So in one way is which we're holding on to ideas that I believe this and everybody else who believes anything different is wrong, and I'm not going to change my mind. And then there's something in the middle about like views are helpful and supportive, and I'm holding them a little bit lightly. A good example of this is right view, wise view, as I mentioned earlier, where the Buddha, he recognized the importance of views because it influences our actions, it influences our aspirations, it influences just the way our thoughts, our priorities, has such an integral way in which we navigate the world. And so he offered right view at the beginning of the Eightfold Path. One way we might understand or work with right view is just using it as a framework to say, okay, there's suffering, and there's a way to the ending of suffering. We could simplify right view in this way as a framework in which to view our experience. Does this lead to suffering or away from suffering? And that could be really helpful to be sensitive to that. But we can also hold on to the Buddha's teachings as a way that to recognize that clinging to views is still clinging. And clinging does not lead to greater freedom. It's clinging that leads to suffering. So that doesn't mean that we should get rid of right view or something like this, but instead we can maybe building on the simile of the raft, is that the teachings are a raft that brings us from this shore, in which there's suffering and difficulties, and over this expanse of water to the other shore, where there's the ending of suffering. So we use the teachings, right, to help as a raft that brings us to the other side. And for those of you who are familiar with this simile of the raft, you'll know that the Buddha gives the teaching, when you get to the other side, you don't think like, wow, that was so helpful. I don't think I could have got across without that raft. Now I'm going to carry this raft wherever I go, on my head and shoulders. It has this little detail in the suttas. On my head and shoulders, just in case I might need it. No. That's like clinging to views. It's like we hold it when it's helpful and let it go when it's not helpful. So this opposite of kind of clinging. And then, so that's maybe, I'm talking about this spectrum. So we have this really clinging, like using views and as a way to bring more freedom and ease, peace, love, goodness into our lives. And then we might say there's this other side, which maybe in some ways we would even say is not on the spectrum, but is on the opposite end. And this is this freedom from the attachment of views. An awakened, completely awakened people who has overcome all attachments. It's part of what liberation is. It's just recognizing that things are arising and passing. They arise due to conditions. And some way there's no reification of anything. Saying like, I like this, I don't like that. Doesn't happen because there isn't this self in the center that is different or distinct from whatever's arising, different than what's all the conditions. It's just part of the conditions that are arising. And there's no need to hold on and grasp to a view. Have a view when it's helpful and put it down when it's not helpful. And then so that's maybe I'll say the end of the spectrum. And so the Buddha's position is not that all views should be discarded. It's just that we're flexible in how we use them. And the movement towards freedom is clinging or holding on to them less and less and less until there's just maybe more like a flowing of experience or of conditions coming and going. So this idea of spiritual bypassing is a way in which we might use spiritual teachings or practices as a way to help us avoid what's uncomfortable. So what was supposed to, maybe we started Buddhist practice or meditation practice because we wanted to find more ease in our life. And then we discover that it doesn't necessarily help us, but in the way that is unrelieving, but just helps us avoid. And then one of the ways this spiritual bypassing is happening is by clinging to views. And it's like, I know the truth, or not being willing to have this beginner's mind or an open mind to some other ideas. So maybe I'll end there and open it up to see if there's some questions or comments about this topic, spiritual bypassing or clinging to views.
Thank you. What I was thinking about as you spoke, which is kind of overlaps with what you're talking about, is the comfort of delusion, which is kind of what I've been reflecting on lately. Like there's some delusion that's really uncomfortable, we want to get out of it quickly, but there's also a lot of comfort in delusion. And then the motivation to resolve it it's tricky. And so as you were speaking, I was thinking like, well, it overlaps with what you're talking about, because when I know what my opinion is, then I know who I am. And there's comfort in knowing who I am. And it's more uncomfortable to abide in that uncertainty of not having a set identity sometimes, not being so fixated, not so clearly formed, right? Sometimes it's more uncomfortable, that unknowing and less definite place.
So I would like to ask you, so when we have this, like, I know and I have this truth, it's the self-righteousness that comes up sometimes, right? We all do this, we all have this, right? But is it, maybe in that moment it feels good, right? Because there's this upsurge of energy, but there's this sense of disconnection too, right? There's a sense of,
sure. Ultimately, it's uncomfortable, and even absolutely, and it's divisive, and it's there's a lack of connection because I'm opposing, absolutely, but also the comfort of delusion is even just like falling asleep in the chair, watching the TV show on a Saturday afternoon, kind of just falling into, it's very comfortable.
Yeah. And sometimes we need this, though. I want to say sometimes humans need to kind of like disengage and recharge. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, we need it until we don't need it, but we convince ourselves we need it.
Yeah. This is part of practice, is to figure out that, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, why would we, the comfort of delusion is all these different nuanced levels. Sometimes it's clinging to a strong view. Sometimes it's having no opinion. Sometimes it's just spacing out. Sometimes it's, but there's this stickiness, which is the the language gets nuanced because we can say it's the unwillingness to see clearly, but it's not the unwillingness, it's just there's delusion, right? Anyway, it's been my reflection lately that, the comfort of delusion and how to overcome that. Sometimes it's clearer than others, and then, there's just delusion.
Yeah. I guess I wouldn't use the word delusion. There's delusion, right? It has a little bit pejorative flavor to it. At least in my ears it does. But sometimes we are unknowingly disengaging because we don't feel like we have the energy or the capacity or the wherewithal to meet with what's happening. And I feel so much about practice is about just increasing our capacity to be with whatever is arising. So we don't have maybe the capacity right now, but maybe we have more capacity than we used to, and maybe we'll be able to hold those uncomfortable experiences or thoughts or something like that.
Yes, absolutely. The word delusion is just the word that's used. So it's not, I'm not using it in a critical sense in the moment, but it's ignorance or whatever. It's the word that's used in the classical sense, right? So just where we aren't enlightened, we aren't clear, we aren't with it.
Right, until we become awakened. We all have that, right? But
and we're not quite motivated to overcome it.
Well, you probably wouldn't be here if there wasn't a part of you that was motivated.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else have a comment or a question? Okay. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for your practice and for being here, and wishing you a good rest of the evening.